The military strength of a faction is largely related to its ability to protect its home planet. We've previously examined the home bases of sci-fi factions, with a focus on space stations, ground-based defenses, and a planet's general defensibility. Today, we'll be looking specifically at space forces and home fleets. 40K is still on timeout, so today we'll be comparing the Byss Defense Fleet of the Empire, the Coruscant Home Fleet of the Republic, the Citadel Defense Fleet of the Citadel Council, and the High Charity Defense Fleet of the Covenant. And one thing you might notice is that most of these specific forces have actually been featured on the channel before now. That's because this video is supposed to be definitive in that it's a four-way battle, a final battle of sorts, and is made with the best information I have. We'll also take these fleets at their prime, which is notable for some of them like the Citadel Defense Fleet. As always, we will try to control for differences of universal power in this video, so we won't be examining whether a CCS class cruiser is more powerful than a Star Destroyer, though we will consider something like the degree of militarization within a faction, how many resources were dedicated to defense, how many large ships were on defensive duty. You get the picture. Let's start with one of my favorite forces in science fiction, the Byss Defense Fleet. After the destruction of the second Death Star, the Empire splintered, with warlords establishing micro-empires across the galaxy. Individuals like Thrawn or Zinj threatened the New Republic, but without Imperial unity, these belligerents were always eventually defeated. It wasn't until Palpatine returned in a new clone body to fill the power vacuum left by his first death that the Empire truly banded together to launch a coordinated assault against the New Republic. From the chaos of Imperial infighting was born Operation Shadow Hand, which originated from the Deep Core and specifically the Imperial Fortress world of Byss. Protecting Byss was one of, if not the, greatest collection of starships in galactic history, what I've termed the Byss Defense Fleet. We've got to be very, very careful, because as we learn on page 35 of the Dark Empire sourcebook, it was not only protective ships that collected around Byss, but a majority of the Dark Empire's power. So I'll take the fleet right after the Battle of Mon Calamari. So for example, the World Devastators, though they would have spent a lot of time in orbit, will not be counted. Notwithstanding that, the faction's greatest asset here is its super weapons. The two Eclipse Super Star Destroyers were certainly defending the planet and were the flagships of Palpatine. They were mounted with miniature super lasers, which could destroy, without exaggeration, any other ship of any fleet featured today. The Dark Empire sourcebook explains that the Eclipse Super Star Destroyers, the World Devastators, and other new Dark Empire ships were far beyond the technology of the New Republic, and we don't actually see the New Republic destroy any Dark Empire technology outright. It's always through sabotage or really good luck. Not counted on this list will be the Galaxy Gun, which despite being in orbit around Byss is not properly part of the fleet itself, or really that useful in any sort of defense, or the Sovereign Super Star Destroyers, which were not actually finished construction. Of course, super weapons and new ships represented only a small portion of the fleet, and much of the defense of Byss was supplied by reacquired Imperial-era ships, and assets Palpatine created during his reign, but squirreled away. We do get some nice shots of Byss, specifically in issues 2 and 4 of the Dark Empire comic. I noticed two things in these images. One, the fleet is basically unending. Two, it's made up of a variety of ships, not only Star Destroyers, but smaller frigates, and especially larger battle cruisers and dreadnoughts. So we know it's big, but it's hard to guess numbers. I think an interesting way to look at it is to consider the total Imperial assets available at the time and guess how many were dedicated to the cause. The Empire, at its peak, had over 25,000 Star Destroyers. If we assume, quite generously to the New Republic, that half of these were destroyed and only half of the remaining ones joined the cause, that gives us over 6,000 Star Destroyers alone. Sure, many of these would have been sent out in raids, but we also know that Palpatine left a very significant portion of his forces around Byss. That's why the planet's destruction at the end of Empire's End is really the beginning of the end for the Galactic Empire. We know from the Dark Empire sourcebook that Byss served as a military staging area, refueling depot, and that when Palpatine was marshalling his forces, hundreds of ships were arriving on an hourly hourly basis. Page 80 of the book also tells us that some fortress worlds would have been protected by hundreds of ships, even during times of peace, depending on their importance, and we know that Byss was the most important fortress world. Add to that, perhaps dozens of Imperial warlords, including Kane, Harsk, Teradoc, and Delvardis, who submitted to the Empire's new rule, and we can see just how powerful the Byss Defense Fleet was. I'm talking thousands, maybe tens of thousands of ships, including perhaps hundreds of dreadnoughts and battlecruisers. Looking at just small portions of the fleet, and you can pick out Vengeance dreadnoughts and Bellator dreadnoughts. We also know that Palpatine sent a dozen Star Destroyers to their death and had no qualms about it, so we're talking serious collection of forces. Next up is the High Charity Defense Fleet. I actually covered this fleet in detail in a full video yesterday, as I knew that this video would be getting quite long and that the breakdown deserved some real attention. I specifically estimated that the fleet had 800 ships, based on various factors, but did leave the ultimate decision up to you guys. In the end, you slightly disagreed with me and thought the numbers were a little bit higher. I'll respect that, and go with 1,200 ships total. I'll maintain, however, my general breakdown of 2 CAS carriers to 5 cruisers, which I think is more than generous. So specifically, that gives us 750 CCS cruisers, 300 CAS carriers, and the majority of the rest are smaller frigates and corvettes. Some of you took issue with my statement that I believe, at max, only one CSO supercarrier was around High Charity, but I stand by this, and in fact believe that there probably weren't any. That's because CSOs were primarily offensive tools, and were best used as force deployers and for occupying worlds. Otherwise, their massive space is wasted. Arguably, a single CSO, which is extraordinarily valuable, is wasted in a defensive fleet. More than one is certainly wasted. To rephrase that, the main asset of a CSO is carrying capacity. High Charity alone is a massive transport and cargo hub. A CSO just isn't needed, and CASs and certainly CCSs are much more effective ships pound per pound. We also would have simply seen a CSO if it were present. It's nearly 30 kilometers long, and the phrase about there being hundreds of these supercarriers near High Charity is obviously a mistake and totally out of line with the scale of the Covenant. Regardless, I'll give them one. Next up is the Coruscant Defense Fleet, and specifically the fleet as it existed at the time of the Republic, right before the Battle of Coruscant, when its numbers were largest. I've actually done a breakdown of the math here in a prior video, which I'll link in case you guys want to see my work. So we know the CIS launched a surprise attack on Coruscant, and did manage to take down a portion of the stationed fleet. Still, after the dust settled, there were still over 1,000 Venators remaining. That tells us about the size and scale of the fleet here. Unfortunately, that's all we have to go off of, and I know that might seem like a lot of ships to some of you, and admittedly it does, but we've seen similar numbers used in other Legends sources. The Order 66 novel specifically talks about thousands of ships reinforcing the planet after the initial attack. Now, I will come back to that in the actual analysis, but we do have to distinguish between the actual defense fleet itself and the ships that arrived as reinforcements. But before we do, let's break down the Citadel Defense Fleet, and for those feeling like I should have included the fleet which attacked Earth in Mass Effect 3, I will mention that later. We'll have to talk fairly broadly here, because Mass Effect doesn't like giving us specific numbers for their space battles. That's okay though, as we're trying to control for differences in universe power of which ship production is included, well, somewhat at least, so specific numbers aren't necessarily important. One thing, however, we have to recognize is that the Citadel races have self-limited when it comes to warship construction, with the Treaty of Phyrexian clearly limiting the number of dreadnoughts a specific faction could have. And just generally, the Citadel Council races aren't nearly as militarized as any other faction on this list, and that's again largely due to geopolitical issues. The Citadel itself is also not the home of any individual faction within the universe, rather it's sort of like their United Nations. So they do still have a home fleet, but more of just a joint base. So the Alliance, for example, or the Turians would still be dedicating a good number of forces to their own homeworld, as well as forces shared at the Citadel. The flagship of the Citadel Defense Fleet is the Destiny Ascension, which does seem to be the only dreadnought at the station during Saren's attack in Mass Effect 1. However, we also know that during that battle, the fleet was not at its prime, as forces had been spread across the galaxy. Still, and now I'm also transitioning into ranking, I think it's clear that the Citadel Defense Fleet is the least powerful of any on this list. Even when controlling for technological differences, Mass Effect races just haven't militarized to the same extent as any other. That's largely because of the focus on galactic cooperation and peace between different factions, while the Covenant, or the Empire for example, focus on conquering, not sharing, but leading the galaxy by themselves. Not only are Mass Effect factions less militarized, but the Citadel also isn't their true homeworld, and a lot of resources would have been dedicated to peacekeeping. For what it's worth, I think the fleet at Earth in Mass Effect 3 would have to be given the #1 spot on this list because it represents almost all available military assets within the galaxy. But let's continue, and instead of doing a clear ranking from worst to best, I'd like to take a look at the two Star Wars factions specifically. Previously, I've actually said that I think the Coruscant Defense Fleet would beat the Byss Defense Fleet, but I've changed my mind. And no, it's not because I've got no consistency or integrity, but because I've just thought about things differently. First of all, I will admit that I was underestimating the forces of the Byss Defense Fleet, and I think it's unfair to count Republic reinforcements as part of the Coruscant Guard. I think the numbers were closer to equal, probably about 2,000 Republic ships before the CIS surprise attack, with a similar number of Imperial cruisers. When you add in superweapons, the increasing technology, and the many dreadnoughts used by the Empire, I think it's clear that they pull ahead. If you think about it, the Empire had militarized over the entire galaxy. By the time of Operation Shadow Hand, although some of the military had been destroyed, it was now incredibly concentrated around one planet. And that's why, again, the destruction of Byss was so devastating, because so many lives and so many ships were lost. There's literally an impenetrable screen wrapping around the entire planet, so I give the benefit to the Empire. But how does the Covenant fit into all of this? I've honestly went back and forth for hours just trying to figure this out, and for me it's not about numbers, because I do think all in all the Empire probably had more ships around Byss than the Covenant did around High Charity, but it's about proportion and what percentage of the assets were dedicated for defensive purposes. And I think the Covenant has to get #1. The Covenant Empire here is at its height, and they've controlled much of the galaxy unopposed. Like the Empire during Operation Shadow Hand, they do have fleets off throughout the galaxy attacking and conquering space, but right now at least, High Charity is the heart of their empire, home to not only millions of living beings, but most importantly, the prophets. So while I don't think it was loaded with CSO supercarriers, I do think it was the largest collection of ships ever seen since the end of the Flood Forerunner War, and I think it slightly outclasses the Byss Defense Fleet, again, when controlling for the differences between universes. If the Empire hadn't just lost so many ships due to the Imperial Mutiny and the larger Imperial Civil War, and were still at the height of their power, I think the Empire would easily win, especially because there were so many superweapons around the planet. That, however, is just my opinion. I would love to hear what you guys think. Before I leave, however, I will quickly take a question of the day. So Leo asks about the death of the Emperor. First of all, I don't think there's a scenario where Palpatine dies of old age. He's just too powerful. But if he did die through some other means and couldn't return to power, then I think the Empire can't help but fall apart. The power vacuum is just too great. Palpatine, and a few select advisors I guess, make every decision that is important to the guidance of the Empire. And what's more, Palpatine's force power is literally used to influence his minions and keep the Empire itself together. Without either of those things, I think the Empire falls apart, and just the sheer size of the power vacuum, which I mentioned, means that there will be countless little empires fighting it out to try to gain control, and that just leads, I think, to self-destruction. That's just my opinion though. Make sure you guys include your own questions in the comments with hashtag AskEck. Anyways guys, until next time, may the Force be with you.